Gashrin. All right, I got a hodgepodge today. Sorry I missed yesterday. I got a hodgepodge of things. Looking for a good picture. This one might work. I don't know. I'll take it. I shall take it. A few different things have been kind of on my mind, floating around. Thought we could talk about them, see where we come out. Some of this stuff might just be me. Let me see if this will work. There we go. Some stuff you might find interesting, and of course, if you have anything, let me know. I'm reading a lot about castles lately, and but most specifically, recently about the very concept of the castle. Kind of asking the question. Well, this book is doing something slightly different but the question would be, is if we start with the question, kind of what is a castle? And I think you close your eyes, you say, what is a castle? Right? What do you get back? You get back, I don't know, some either fantastical or real castle, maybe Croc de Chevalier, which I think this is in Syria, which is kind of a really cool crusader. I think it really maybe the most well preserved, maybe one of the only well preserved kind of crusader castles. Or you get something from a piece of fiction in your head, a drawing, a picture. Camelot. Let's not go there. It's a silly place, kind of thing in your head. And particularly this last book I've been reading, has really been kind of delving into, which I guess is interesting and very scholarly, but interesting, at least interesting for me, is kind of what kind of is a castle anyway. Because apparently, our current notion of what we would consider a castle dates from maybe the middle to late kind of medieval period, and that the argument that this person's making, as my chair descends beneath me, the argument this person is making is that um, the people at the time saying they are, hey, some guy, hold on a minute, my chair. Okay, the argument this person's making is that back in the day, when people were talking about castles, they weren't talking about the things that we would call castles today, or at least not limited to that. That the words castle, and there's some neat stuff from the there are a couple of we call them late or Latin terms for what kind of get roughly translated into as different things of castles, that some of them wouldn't really be a castle, or at least the way we've defined castles, because of this whole, he would call it kind of whole kind of biasing on our part. We would not call castles, even though they were called, I feel like I'm just like, they weren't castles, but they're castles, and they're not castles. They weren't castles. The kind of the upshot is getting to me is to kind of rethinking it a bit, sort of the kind of stronghold element, because I've been thinking, and maybe because I'm thinking more, which is fine. We're playing fantasy games after all. It's kind of literary sort of medieval thing with the castle on the hill, Camelot, if you will, and then you come down, there's the village, and kind of so on and so forth. But one thing I've always been I want to say troubled by, because that's not the word, is like, how do like the walled towns fit into it? On the one hand, you think, okay, you have a castle, there's a community around the castle. This builds up, and at some point, it just kind of aggregates into a town, and you extend the walls around it. That probably has happened. It seems like that's kind of not. I don't think that's kind of how they tended to be created. I mean, there's variants all over the place. I'm making lots and lots of generalizations, but part of the reason why I think along these lines, and part of the reasons why I think about, well, how can we kind of categorize things? How can we kind of generalize things? Is so when we're creating our tools for, let's say, a hex crawl, or building a sandbox or some kind of setting, we can come up with tools where I think these generalizations help. We create some kind of generalizations about terrain, like how long they take to move through, how fast you can move through them, how dangerous they are, and then that allows for us to create tables and things that kind of roll on it. And then when you see one, all you gotta do is look at your map, and all you have to see on that map is that symbol for plains, forest, desert, whatever, and you can, we're making, you're not, we know we're not talking about necessarily every atom in those terrains, but we can say, kind of by using the generalizations about that terrain, which we of course can add detail on top of, we can do a lot of fun stuff. And I'm trying to kind of apply that same logic to the kind of settlement angle, because usually the next step after, okay, you put a bunch of terrain on the ground, is figuring out, well, where are your settlements and what do they look like? And so I've been kind of thinking about, well, how can we kind of categorize and then make some kind of generalizations about our settlements. Hey, Magnus, and this is of course going to be, particular to the kinds of, the implied settings and yada yada yada. My current thinking is, it seems to me that you kind of have these different types of. We have like, well, I guess there are two types of settlements. Right? If I was going to make more room, you have towns and you have villages. All right, so let me just. All right, so, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Can I move you off? Can. All right, so we have settlements, and I'm, sometimes people, I'm just trying to make. So this is kind of one. This is kind of my thinking. Doesn't have to be your thinking. Doesn't have to be whatever. This is kind of how I'm coming about it. How I'm trying to address these things. So I'm not looking for like if your definitions don't agree with mine, that's great. I'm not trying to get bogged down into like, well, over here, over there, or whatever. I'm trying to, again, I'm working in vast generalities. So we have, villages, which are producer settlements. Okay. Raw materials, I should say. Got it right. Raw material producing settlements. And then you have towns, which are consumer, and then I don't know what's the word would be like when you're transforming. You're sort of you're consuming and I don't know, refining. Or I guess I actually like the term I used before. You're functional settlements. Okay. So we got two types of settlements I'm thinking about. Now, a city, you might say, well, what's a city? Those are towns. Cities are just big towns. What's a hamlet? It's a small village, a village of a certain type. So your hamlets, your thorps, your all that kind of stuff would be a village. A town, yeah, your cities, your capitals, they're all towns. They're towns of greater or lesser size. They serve functions. So inside of here, right? So towns need villages. And that is because where do towns get their raw materials from? Either it could be foods, could be metals, right? I'm saying raw materials because we could talk about a mining settlement and they produce, ores, and those ores go to different places, maybe to get processed and blah 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 blah. Um, all that stuff is happening in towns. Some guy says, I kind of treat strongholds and towns the same thing. They're surrounded by 2 to 8 villages and serve as trade center and military for the local population. Yeah, I mean, that's actually some guy. That's kind of what I'm going to be getting at, is this concept of, and this is, I guess, what kind of why I started with castles, but the idea of a castle becomes essentially a type of town with particular functions. And that's kind of what I was, in my long roundabout way, is looking at it like, okay. And I almost feel like I need a different word for it, because castle, like town, right, they have connotations to them. And sometimes it could be easier to come up with a different word that, or use a different word that has different meanings and maybe isn't so embedded in certain things. Because it may be in the end, it's impossible to get people to think about. And maybe that's where I use the term stronghold or something else as a castle, anything but giant stone structure with a lord and lady sitting inside. Uh, Maybe that will never kind of pass if I want to refer to a town with walls as a castle, even though, like this book I'm reading gets super detailed about, people did. People often, that's what kind of what they're talking about, is back in when people were writing about this, contemporary accounts, let's say, of castles and the like, though they didn't use the term castle, they might, or they, I don't know if they did. I don't know when the term castle first came out, but there would be the kind of Latin and other language precursors, or at least whatever that translates to castle, that they were using it for kind of anything that basically had defenses. And they had other words, and we would, and I guess what would happen is, over time, or at least part of it would happen historically over time, is people would go back through these things written, in early French, or in some combination of French and Latin, Spanish and Latin, English and Latin, whatever, Latin and Latin, Italian and Latin. and they would they just translate all the words as kind of castle, or they would say, no, I don't think that is a castle, even though, and this person's kind of the idea of the book is like, why did we, or not really asking kind of asking and answering the question of sort of why did this change, why if they all these people referred to these things as castles, do we not? And part of, I think, the book is kind of saying, what are we missing about sort of some of the medieval period, because our view of castles has become so narrow, when in reality they were a lot more diverse, which means there are a lot more of them than you might have. We might currently think, oh, there's like however many castles there are, but really those are the castles of a very narrow type. Whereas if you broaden it, you'd probably say, wow, there's even more of those things than there were. Frederick says that Dragon Magazine number 80 has a great starter city. Well, I mean, I'm not even getting into city stuff yet. Cities, I think, are kind of, I don't want to say dicey, but here's the other thing too, right? And I've talked about this in the past. I did a short, had some good responses on that kind of realism part. Is this stuff interests me, and it interests me. And I think there's some interesting stuff in there, which is why I ponder it. But I am painfully aware of the fact that it might, that at some point, whatever granularity I'm getting into, whatever distinctions I'm trying to make, are not useful at the table. So part of what I'm trying to always keep in mind, or maybe rein myself back in on, is, does this stuff become gameable? What are the kind of gameable things? And I'm hoping that's where kind of making some generalities. And of course, there are going to be exceptions and blah, 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 but making some, and of course, anybody for a particular setting, this is kind of my implied setting here, whatever your setting is, whether it's explicit or implied, feel free to change the rules. Brian Smith says Hodgepodge of Hacks is their favorite 5th level fighter ability. Well, it's good to know that I made 5th level. That we make these distinctions. So what I've been thinking about is, you're looking at, so kind of maybe the next point of this is, okay, so we have basically, I feel like every hex with a settlement, 3-mile hexes at this point, is going to have some kind of stronghold. And my thinking, and this can be different again for your game, your campaign, your world, it can be different, is, you think about, why is this? Why does every 3-mile hex need a stronghold? Or maybe I would say you could have one next door, because 3 miles is not that big, but it's that you have monsters. I mean, you have, forgetting humans and the monsters of humanity that are running around, which we clearly know through history, right? The medieval period didn't need fantasy monsters to require all these defenses and castles. We had enough monsters we made ourselves. But then you add in real monsters. So forgetting all of humanity and its darkest impulses and that stuff going wild and crazy, then you actually have actual monsters that a lot of them can kind of appear, out of nowhere, or just come out through the sky, or a portal opens up, or whatever, out of some mountain fastness they decide to descend. Like, you need these strongholds. Some guy says the confusion about castles and historical accuracy is why they decide to lean more towards the implied game setting and general misconceptions of the medieval and ancient world. Yeah. So, and Brian likes the license to crenulate. That was a real thing, Brian Smith, the license to crenulate. In fact, I don't even know if it, it's this idea that you had to get a license to make your abode defensible, to add walls and things, or at least defensive kind of walls to your. And I think even in the 19th century, at least in the England, I think, or in the United Kingdom, UK, you would apply for a license to crenulate. I just threw that in there because I like it, and it kind of adds to kind of what we're talking about. Frederick says that the OG implied setting sets up a very Arthurian-like setting. Yes, it does. Very much like castles in the middle of some kind of wilderness, and there's a little bit here. What was I saying? Okay. So I'm just going to kind of put some rules. So I think that a settled hex, whoops, I don't know why I don't want an eraser. No, what are you doing? Got too many of these. Okay. Settled hexes require strongholds. A stronghold is a defensive town. And I almost feel like I should probably capitalize town. Brian Smith says our next PC background is going to be unlicensed chronoleader. Are you doing that to other people's? Would that be like unbonded? What would you call the person who does? Because it's the owner of the house. It would be the unlicensed chronoleader. Would you be like you wouldn't have a bond? Or maybe you'd be a dubious back alley chronoleader. Okay, so a stronghold, aka your classic castle, is in this. And I the term I may have to change the terms, make it too confusing. I confuse myself. Is a town that's function as military, aka defensive. Okay, right. So defensive town is a stronghold. I think a settled hex needs some kind of defensive structure. Like I said, I think between whatever the dominant species is interfighting with themselves or having allegiances that can change. Certainly if we're talking about kind of medieval type fantasy, we don't even, there's not the whole idea of kind of empire isn't really there, right? The kingdoms and things of the Middle Ages are not like the Roman Empire because they're all those sort of chains of allegiance, and things can flip flop all over the place. And particularly the further back you go, you can see all these little flip flops going back and around, right? That thing that you may look at from when you're zoomed down on a map of Europe and you see, Francia circa 800, and it seems like this beautiful, clean, single color, showing of everything that is the kingdom of the Franks. When you start to zoom in there and you start to play it over time, if you could, you'll see all kinds of things are happening. Even they don't bubble up to say, oh, they're leaving the whole Frankish Empire. All this stuff's bubbling up. Things are happening all over the place. And of course, that's before you add monsters in. So if you have a settled hex, that is a settled hex, meaning a hex with some kind of settlement on it, there has to be a stronghold. Now, the stronghold could be I think in addition, and I think because we have these villages, right, you need a stronghold defensive town, and towns need villages. You can't fit a whole village in most walled situations because farming, things like that. I'm sure it's been done, but I think for the most part, maybe a distinction is villages are not really walled. If it's walled, it's a town. I think, right? You might have now. That's not to say that and this really doesn't, it's not to say that it's impossible. What I'm saying, I guess, is for me, that's part of that lines I'm drawing to try to organize things. Now, looking at a lot of stuff, and I did a stream a few weeks ago now, might have been a little bit longer than that, where I looked at this, I forget the name of this concept, but there were these Gaulish walled towns, and it was a similar functionality. They would build these walled towns where it was kind of during the Roman period, I think post Caesar, or maybe before, during, and post Julius Caesar, that is. So right at the end of the Roman Republic, they were building these great towns, and the town would have the village kind of beneath it where all the farming was. And then going back to how I've been defining town, all the functional buildings were inside the walled structure, but all the little farms were down below. And of course, in times of trouble, people could take their belongings and come up to the forts. RPG Grandma says a fallback fort. Yeah, like called a ring, right? Ring forts and all those things. They come bubble up. So where do I think the gaming part of this comes from? So I'm going on and I'm blah blahing a lot about these towns and walled towns and strongholds, because I think so. Here the idea is, I think you can. And I'm just going to write this down. I think you can say something about the community. Hold on, let me just write. What does the defensive town, aka the stronghold, say about the community? So here's where I hope to kind of get into what we could look at with kind of the gamey part of it. I was kind of hoping that would word wrap, but it didn't. Okay, I'll just have to make it big. So if we look in the castles, right? What do castles say? So the stereotypical castle is kind of a privatized stronghold. What does that say about it? It might be, it might be better to go kind of in reverse. So we have a let's look at let me look at this differently. If you have a walled town, what does a walled town require? They're hard to do to make, and it's not even just the walls. It's it can be just walls. I mean, there are lots of different things, right? Some people, so they'll talk about ramparts where they'll just have these earthworks. And inside, I think I even found it up here. Hold on a minute. It might even be. Let me see if I search. I know there was a cool rampart. Sorry, things I should have. Rampart, maybe. There we go. I thought there was a good picture of a rampart here. Or was a. Oh, there might have been another word for it, but it was like maybe it was like a something rampart. I could probably find a minute. Like you have a rampart, which basically kind of an earthworks type deal. If you're going to do this around a whole town, even if the town is modest, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of effort. That takes a lot of a lot of resources and organization to do that. To do a whole town. Oftentimes, I think, I'm sure not always, but a lot of times the towns were planned. The walled towns were planned things. So you would find the site, you would put everything down, and you could figure out. And they talk about some of these early kind of wall, not early, but some of the, say, like these Gallic walled towns had kind of were planned out. The town was built, the walls weren't built just around the town willy-nilly. It was you had kind of an ordered town plan, and that town plan incorporated walls. Some guy says it depends on the population of your settlements. I'm not sure I agree with that. Some guy, I'm sure there are cases where it's true, but again, it's relative, right? The resources it will take to put your village or your any kind of settlement and wall it, it's not dependent on the size of the village. It's dependent on your resources, which is also kind of dependent on the size of your village. But if you have 10 people and 5 houses, you still have to somehow do all that stuff, right, with the amount of people you have. So whether it's 1,000 people and 10 houses, or 10 people, one house, like the numbers matter. But I feel like I don't feel like it's the size so much. It's that. So what happens is you need resources, right? What are the resources you need to build a structure, any kind of structure, anything? You need people. You're going to need food. You're going to need people. I guess I should write this down. You're going to need people. Let's take a look at let's marshal our resources. We're going to need people. Oops. People. Nope. Didn't want that. Oh, hit the wrong button. Here we go. I get that. What happened? How come I couldn't open you up? Oh, you're annoying me. I'll just make it again. Okay. Let's try this again, Ouija. Stay with me here. It's called resources. You need people. People power. You need tools. You need some level of expertise. And you need food. And you need the raw materials. Okay. This is all the kind of stuff. Whatever you're doing around your settlement, whatever settlement you're building, you need all that stuff. The people one, all these things are going to be are all kind of relative. The bigger your settlement you're trying to wall or do whatever to, the more people you're going to need. But right, so but it's kind of a percentage number. If your village is small, sure, you need less people, but you have less people to draw on as well. It's like if I need half the people to build the walls and do the earthworks and make this kind of whole thing going on, that's still half the people. Whether it's 1,000, we started with 1,000, whether that's 100, half the people's half the people. You need the tools, and they'll probably have the tools. That's probably the least one because hands. I mean, if you're starting with earthworks, you just need something you could dig with, which can be almost anything. Could be even hands if you needed to. You need whatever, right? You need that kind of element. Expertise, maybe for the earliest things, you don't. RPG Grandma says animal labor can help. Yeah, sure, it can to a degree, but a lot of the stuff good for dragging and doing some things. But yeah, a lot of the unfortunately, the animals that can do the most of the digging and things is going to be people. But yeah, animals can help, and then obviously you need the raw materials. And you need to feed all these people. And here's the issue with just get the kind of the villagers themselves to kind of just do it. Is the same people who you need to build the walls are the people who are doing all your farming and cultivating, and they don't tend to have a lot of surplus. And this is where it gets into kind of like, what are we walling, right? If we get down to what does this right? I get that. Nope. Yes. What now we come back to this. What is this defensive town? What does it say about the community? Is you need to have some kind of surplus or some kind of management of resources beyond kind of individuals for their family to really make a go of it. You just kind of have to because you're going to be either pulling people, you're going to be pulling people out of circulation, and then you just need to feed them. Uh, so you need to have that. And the other alternative is like, well, the other thing you need to do is, well, if you're not going to do that, or if you're going to say like, tough, we're doing it anyway, then you need to have the authority to pull all these people out of their homes and do it. So you need kind of strong, leadership, right? Strong leadership. And I don't mean good leadership. I'm not saying that these have to be, Solomon on the throne. No, I'm just simply saying that it's got to be, they have to have the authority. Maybe I should say authority is maybe it to do it. So if you end up with a castle, a stereotypical castle, or if you end up with if you have a walled town, these things can say different things about the folks who live there. And it doesn't, we can, and you can have fun playing with the timelines because one of the things I keep looking like I have the book in print, but I don't. I just have it in PDF. Is you find these neat things like word, right? How we get some of our English words, or you see English place names in England, like like a lot of the names that end in Chester. That comes from the Latin word castrum for a fortified town. So you get to the medieval period, and some of those towns had walls, not because when everything broke down and petty lords took over, they had the resources to build the walls for those towns, but because the towns were already walled. They already had them because the Romans did it. The Romans, who had the strong authority, had the expertise, the tools, could feed, had the logistics. Maybe this is kind of the way to look at it, right? The logistics to do everything, could get these towns walled up. Alfred the Great also went through a campaign, and not just him, but I think starting with him and then some of his successors, also walling towns. This was in direct response to the incursions of the Vikings and the kind of Viking age. And there was some famous figure whose name I can't remember right now. It was actually a lady, and she and her brother, I think, they did a lot of that, where they would retake towns from the Vikings or the Danes or whoever, the Scandinavians who were on the grounds, and they would recapture the towns and then fortify them. Then, of course, is a great need, right? So you can overcome some of these things by just saying we have an emergency thing that's going, but that strong authority is still there. This was, I guess, Wessex, right? Was the name of the kingdom, Wessex, and they had strong leadership in that time, so they could still kind of do some of those things. So you have those things. If you don't have those things, then maybe you end up with just like the Mont and Bailey kind of ring fort sort of deal, where it was. And again, I think there's a good picture here, or I think maybe, hold on a minute, let me see if they have it. Now, this isn't a very good one. I thought there was a fairly good illustration. That's a stone one. I know there's something like this, or maybe this is a better one. Something like that, which was basically some kind of earthworks, right? The motte, which would be the the earthen mound, have a ditch around it, and then you would have a wall around it, and then your key functional buildings would be inside the walls, inside the bailey, and then you'd have this kind of tower, and you could put your lookouts in the tower, and presumably you could also try to get in the tower if you needed. People could come and get into the walls, but it wasn't something that was really. I think at least the early ones, from what I understand, were not occupied all the time. They were kind of in emergencies. Maybe you have watch, you have someone on the watch there potentially, but they were kind of like in emergencies, run to this place and go. They were communal. And I think that's the other point that this book I've been reading about castles has been emphasizing is that these things started off as being very communal. Like we look at it now and we think of castles as like as the private residence of such and such a lord, but that wasn't really the case. Yes, people were put in charge of them, castellans. You had lords were given permission or just kind of assumed their right to build their castles, but there was the communal aspect in that the castle, this place was the strong point that you would fall back to when you're attacked by so on and so forth. You get back in that castle. I mean, that you have that sort of the kind of courtyard area. The castle would be, you could all, get in there. So if you have castles in an area, that could say something about your who's here. And this is kind of where I'm trying to get more into the gaming thing. My ideal scenario is that if I was running a game and you guys were my players and you came across a walled town, you might think and say, well, that tells me something about either the town as it is now or their history of how the town was, says something about what's happening in this town, that the town is organized, that it's potentially got, or at least had, when the walls are built, some kind of strong kind of leadership, and it's got a certain vibe to it. Whereas if you come across a bunch of villages with castles in the distance, that also tells you something a bit different. If you're building the castle, is probably easier to build. And remember, a castle does not have to be stone. It could be like that Mont and Bailey. Could just be could be wood. You can replace the wood with stone kind of as you're going, and oftentimes with the ring forts and these different places, they would try to find, instead of building up a mound beneath it, they would try to find somewhere that's already elevated. You find the lone hill, you find whatever, and then you do it. Magnus says, "Would kill to be in a game I'm running." Well, please don't. No killings. Some guy says part of why villagers would agree to work for lords is because of that promise of being allowed in that keeper tower during a crisis. Yes, and some guy, not only you're correct, but I mean that's part of the charter. I mean, they would get these, and that book, which as someone else to get some stuff out, they have one of these written things where the guy would basically have his document, not even document, like I think it is someone documented it. I don't know if they signed it or where they said it, but basically laying out like, I swear, like I am given this thing, and part of that contract with the lord of the castle is, yes, we're coming in, right? This is where we're getting away from the bad guys. So we're looking at, and again, I just all this stuff is kind of like, to me, it's just like brain fuel, and just kind of like, how can I get my mind working in different things? Other thing is, I'm trying to finalize some tools, and the stuff just keeps intruding on me, and I want to try to integrate it, but I don't know the best way how yet. So I'm kind of talking it out here in hopes I can reach some kind of some kind of thing that I can try to map out in a somewhat of an easy way. I'm not familiar with Kingdom Come Deliverance, and let me just take a sip of water for the working man. So this idea that you could have these things, they say so. So if you have a walled town, like literally like a walled town, and this is where I can't use the word town for everything, because then what is a town? If you have a walled town, and I might want to use maybe I should use the Latin words. I'll just throw some of these in here. I have something. So if you want to pull in some Latin words for the working man, I'll just throw some of these out here that I know, because that's part of it, and that's part of the thing this book gets into. Castrum, Castra. These were walled towns. So at least in some of the either kind of early-ish medieval writings using these kind of late Latin phrases, also, or just coming from the Latin, is you end up with castrum. And I had some more of these. I'll just pull up here. Castrum, kind of Castra, which was a walled town. So and these are the kind of things that over time people just started, as they were kind of studying and addressing things, it just started eliminating, like, nope, that's not an actual castle. Then I got a couple other ones here. We've got a turris, which was a tower. We've got an arx, which was a citadel. Let's see, they called it a munitio, which was a fortification. And let's see what else we got here. And then when they would call something like a castle, with, I think it was like they also would use the word castellum, which I think is where we get castle from. That was kind of a status, right? This was a right, kind of a fortified symbol with a fortified settlement that was kind of a status symbol. Not that, again, it didn't have to mean somebody's personal residence, but it was some place that had kind of some sort of status attached to it. It was, premium. We might call it premium, some kind of maybe an aura, something a little extra, just a status symbol. Maybe more, it would be more sort of maybe more of a some kind of center. We might call it a city in some cases. Let's see. Average Grandma says the stone foundations with wooden structures on top are very common. Yeah, that's like that a rampart with palisades or stakes on top. Yep, there was all kinds of tricks, right? But all that stuff took time and money. So who's doing it? So something to think about. And I'm going to try to formalize these in some way, at least for my implied setting, kind of what these things mean. But I thought it was this kind of the journey I've been going on. So I thought I would kind of just work it out, talk about it a bit, and lay it out there. But it's really some interesting, some neat ideas. And just I guess I would say maybe if it suits you, think about when you're designing or you're plunking stuff down, like what these settlements kind of, how they're fortified or how they're laid out in relation to one another. Like, what does that say about the kind of system reasoning? I think we end up, oftentimes we end up just kind of, well, it's just sort of feudal. So it's got castles and it's got villages and towns, or just, whatever, or like, massive cities like Waterdeep, and that's fine. Nothing, you love that stuff, go with it. But I guess I kind of I really enjoy maybe the little bit more grounded type thing, and just thinking about these things like, well, who's running this walled town? Is it who's got it organized? Is it a king? Is it a religious cult? Have the priest kings set this thing up? Like, who's doing it? Did it happen now? Did it happen back in the day? What does it mean? If it's all castle driven, is that just a resource thing? It also could be a lot of competition. That was one of the things that I'm reading in another book, talking about the kind of the castle rush, where all these different folks who aspired to be kind of lordly would run out and grab the best high spot they could find that wasn't already occupied, and build some kind of fortification on top, because once you had that, you could kind of command the neighborhood, and then you could start setting down rules, and you could start kind of reaping the benefits, which could be, depending on, and I think there is some different views, seems like the scholars, which is obviously way over my head, talking about these different, as to how sort of robber barony these different individuals were. I'm sure it's probably a mix, and they probably weren't all just looking to just totally off the. But it's kind of interesting things, because like one of the things they've talked about was one, how the medieval folks, they loved order and really craved order and believed in order. And so they would put up with a lot, at least when there was no alternative, because the alternative, when there was no other way, when it's like you could have order, but it's going to be terrible, or chaos, they would take order if it's terrible over the chaos, which I guess probably makes sense given what chaos could look like in those times with everything going on. They're probably like, yeah, we'll take the jerk that we know over the jerks that we don't know, kind of thing. What was the thing? Oh, so everyone just putting up these settlements, like that could be what castles like in your area, or it could be that they're defensive, but they're defensive and sort of privatized, where kind of people have taken over that part, or it's because they can't really afford to wall all the towns and stuff up like they may want to, or there are really no towns. They don't have that kind of commerce isn't available yet, so dealings are going. They do have some functional stuff, but that's up in the walled citadel or whatever, in the fort, the keep, the castle. That's where all the stuff is. And so that's where people are dealing with, and there just really is no towns. The towns just haven't really developed there yet. Towns are elsewhere. In that case, kind of the town is the town at the castle, if you will, is both the defensive point, the administrative point, and the commercial point. Hey, oh yeah, what's this about hacks? Yep. RPG Grandma says, also don't forget, everyone always thinks their culture is the bestest. Yes, absolutely. There's totally, people are blindsided by that. So it's just some stuff so I thought it was interesting. I thought I would share at some point. Maybe I'll hopefully I'll have something more. Hey, this is something more immediately useful to your games than that, but maybe dig out. There's some really fascinating history reading about is it Aquitaine? No, where am I reading about? I can't remember which part of France, where they're kind of zooming in one of the books, talking about some of the developments there. But it's pretty neat stuff with just these reasons why castles grow up. And I think the other thing with walled, like the part of it too, is right outside of these areas. Again, going back to the difficulty, because I guess one of the things that maybe is fascinating is I think we take these walled towns for granted, and I'm starting to think that we shouldn't, because it wasn't as easy as you might think. And you get outside of these areas that had kind of empire level states, or just really just states able to do things. So you have the Romes, the different empires in the Near East, China and places like that. Like they were walling towns up left and right and doing all stuff because they could. But then you end up in these places where they didn't have that. You're into some of these areas, like in Europe, where they either didn't have it or they didn't have a lot of it. And so they never had these towns. So I think once you have these walls, it's probably much easier to keep them up and keep going despite changes and whatever, than to obviously put them up as a whole new project. So then it becomes, again, that resource game. Well, we can't wall up the whole town or village. It's just not conceivable. But what we can do is there's a hill over there. We could build something on top of the hill and we can all run to it, make a much smaller thing that is, even though in the end, 100 or whatever years later, when the castle's been transformed and it starts off as wood, then maybe it's wood and stone, then it's stone. You think like, oh my gosh, whatever. But the fact is that might have been done in certain periods of high stress or high time. But the fact is that less resources than to try to do that over the circumference of that thing. What sort of, just the tack that things took. And oftentimes defensively, but sometimes definitely was status. Neat stuff. Hey, RPG Grandma. Well, thanks for hanging out. Okay. So that was that. I had another idea. So totally separate, totally unrelated hack I was thinking about. Someone was, you get these questions that come up, and I laugh sometimes because I think people want to put a lot of thought into things that don't. You see someone who takes the trouble to log on to Reddit and post the question of, how do I know which party member a creature attacks? And it's funny because I guess they presume that there's some deep system, and maybe some people have a deep system. but almost always it's been a thing of either, well, who hit it last? Right, that's usually the default. To me, the default, and no matter what, either I'm running games, I'm playing games, it always seems to be, okay, the owl bear needs to attack. Who damaged it last? Which makes sense. If you hurt the thing, it's probably going to be looking at you and madder at you than anything else. And then if that doesn't exist, it's usually some kind of, all right, roll the die. Okay. Oh, how many people are around the table, virtually or in person? All right, you're 1, 1 to 2, 3 to 4, 5 to 6. And I'm going to roll dice. However, people are in melee with this thing or within reach of this thing, I'm going to roll a die. And I think that's what people ended up in red. We're telling this person in the responses. Bryce says they have the correct answer for $9.95 a month. Exactly. And I don't even remember whether they felt this was worthwhile or not, but just funny because it seems like it's funny to me because we're looking, someone's out there looking, yearning for that. There's some kind of system for that. When really just use whatever random thing you want. Hey, have the players roll dice and choose high or low die. Have them draw cards. Who's got the high die? Who's got the low die? Brian Smith says that DCC has a tie into their luck mechanic with the lowest luck. The lowest luck gets hit with anything that randomly targets. Well, there's another way you can do it, right? You could have a luck like DCC and do that. But here's something I thought about. Probably wouldn't work with the luck mechanic. What if some a few character classes could modify this roll? Ooh. All right. So here's what I'm thinking. I got 2 classes in mind, and I will probably write this up into something like a blog post. So if this interests you and you don't want to copy it off a screen, just give me a little time. But here we go. I got 2 classes in mind. I'd be open to other options. So fighters, obvious. If they are in the same, if they are in the random range, whatever the random attack range, they can force the attack to themselves. Ugh. Okay, does that make sense? I will explain. Fighters, being the masters of all things combat, they can push the attack themselves. In other words, they can muscle their way into it and say, nope, I'm taking that hit. I'm thinking there would be some kind of penalty that their thing for this. I don't know. Maybe we're fighters. I wouldn't. I have another one. You can let me know if you think that's too harsh. Not enough. Brian says some kind of forced duel. Yeah, I'm not talking about that's. Yeah, I'm. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to I don't want to turn it into what 4th edition and 5th edition had, or 5th edition might have had it. 4th edition definitely had it to a degree. Someone's mentioning 3.5, where they could force attacks to themselves, like that kind of like I'm, that what like the MM, and I think this is part of where in 4th edition, whether it's true or not, people got this kind of MMO sense that the game was kind of becoming MMOized with this idea of I'm absorbing aggro, like, oh look, I'm the defender type and it's aggro and I can keep it aggro on me kind of thing. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. I don't want them to be able to do it. So the idea with this here is that this only works if there's no context that sets it up. So if the mage bonked the goblin on the head, but did a very poor job of it, and the goblin turns around to try to shiv the mage, the fighter just doesn't get to interrupt it. Ha, it's me instead. No. But if there is no context, in other words, if the goblin's looking at all 5 of the party gathered around it and is about to do eeny, meeny, miny, mo, then the fighter can then jump in. So, but they also don't have to spend an action. They don't have to declare anything. They could just say, like, if it's getting, I guess as the GM, I would have to declare that, okay, well, there's no target that makes sense. So I'm going to randomly choose. Then the fighter can jump in and say, haha, you shall choose me. And they could do that. And, I was wondering whether there should be some kind of penalty to their AC for that, but maybe you don't even want to penalize that, because maybe you want to encourage that. I think if you're the party and you want to, or if in the game you want to kind of encourage the fighters to do that, that's totally fine. The other one was thieves. Aha. if they are in the random attack range and they are randomly chosen, they can force one reroll of the random selection or redo. So there's the other one. So now we have thieves. These were the two that I'd earmarked. I'd be happy to hear if the suggestions for another one. I don't think this is something every class is to have. This is not something where every class needs one. I thought this was just kind of a clever way of sort of giving the thieves a little bit of shiftiness. This is just, hey, you're shifty. You're shifty. So if the enemy doesn't know which one you attack, you can roll. If they pick you, you can do it one time. You can have them re-rolled again. Brian Smith asked if this would fit best in the monster stat block. Like, this creature prioritizes fighter or something, or this player? No, to me, Brian, this is totally player triggered. This is totally me as the player of the fighter. I'm. It's dire. Circumstances are dire, and I know, if I can eat this hit, but if the cleric takes it, they're toast, or the wizard, or the other fighter, or the person we're trying to protect. So I can do it. No, this is totally player centered. This is not. I'm not trying to write this up for every monster or even every class of monster. This is just something that I felt like was kind of fun. Again, it's not something that's going to come up all the time. They're going to be, oftentimes there's going to be a logic to who they're attacking, and this is not meant to override that logic. This is not meant to, okay, thief, you tried to backstab the guard. Now the guards to try to backstab you, and the thief goes, haha, no, you're going to roll randomly, something like that. This is not that. But this is in situations when there is no context. Just a little thing. So it might happen once or twice. Maybe at the beginning of a combat, it might happen. There might be a weird lull in the combat where all of a sudden just things have shaken out. There's kind of a couple of guys and they haven't engaged with anybody specifically. There are going to be moments where it'll come up, but it won't be everywhere. And it's not the monster's choice. It's the player's choice. And just these two different flavors. Fighters can basically draw attacks to themselves, but they have to be, if it's a melee attack, they have to be in melee. If it's a missile attack, right, they have to be in the right spot. They can't just be jumping all over the map doing it. But if they're in melee, and I'm looking kind of melee being sort of the grand melee, if they're all in kind of that massive melee that's happening, then they can move around that way. Or if they're range, like that. So they can move around a bit. But again, fictional positioning. If they've declared that they're in another room, they can't come running over to take that one attack. But in cases where everyone's kind of together, Brian says you'd have to announce that the part of this attack is random before. Yes, you would have to announce. But to me, Brian, I'm going to say that I think that comes up all the time. Because, or at least for me, in the games I run, if it comes down to it, so just the way I run them, and obviously I can't speak for everybody, but you're fighting an owlbear, and then you're there. Say we have 4 players, and you're all in melee with the owlbear, and stuff has happened, but there is no one obvious that the owlbear should be attacking. No one's hit them. Maybe it's the first round of combat. No one's really hit them yet. Nothing's happened. They don't have, maybe, it's an animal or whatever. Maybe we're saying, okay, it doesn't, or no one's heavily armored. There's nothing that really sets everybody apart. I'm going to be out there and say, okay, I don't know. The owlbear is going to attack one of you randomly. And I'm going to, and I'll say, okay. And I'll usually do it open too. All right. You're 1 to 2, you're 3 to 4, you're 5 to 6. I'll roll it openly to see. I do that all the time. So I guess that's my assumption with these, is that that's how people run them, where it's pretty obvious that it's what's happening. Of course, if you do that differently, then yes, you would have to announce it. But generally, that's the kind of thing I just announce anyway. And it's a good thing to announce, because then if you do have players that might get their feelings hurt, where they might feel like they're being unfairly targeted, when the reality you're doing is behind the screen, you're rolling some kind of die and their number keeps coming up. If you roll it out in the open, then they might feel unlucky, but they're not going to feel like you're out to get them. You're gunning for them. Brian says that paladins could use their ability to protect NPCs or retainers or something heroic. Well, I'm not even, that's even more detailed, Brian, than I want to actually even get into. Like for the fighter, they're part of presumably they're in your allies. So I think you don't have to look for paladinhood to protect one of your friends and allies. But sure, it's really just, because really this is supposed to be just very simple and basic. I'm not trying to get in the weeds, right? What I liked about this, what appealed to me about this kind of mechanic, was that it doesn't require it doesn't require a whole lot of extra, really any extra mechanics. It's just I'm gonna roll a random attack. The fighter can say, "Hit me," or I roll random attack and thief, you were chosen. Thief can go, "Nope, reroll." That's it. Like it's really supposed to be simple. I just like the way it kind of fits into both those classes potentially. With both those classes, kind of get a little bit extra. Fighters can be more. They could utilize that armor class they have. They could utilize that extra, that heavy armor they're wearing, that armor AC2 or AC whatever 18, that their plate mail and shield, and they can say, you know what, you're about to hit the thief or the mage with their AC 5, 6, 7, 8, blah blah blah. No, you're going to hit me instead, or attempt to, because it hasn't, obviously the attack hasn't been rolled yet. And then for thieves, they can just try to be sneaky. Some guys says, with these abilities be once per encounter, or would it be a daily thing? I'm not even going to worry about that, some guy, because I don't think they would happen that much. Like I said, my conceptually, and I would always defer to you guys and your experiences, but how often does it come up in these combats where the enemies or the assailants don't have, because remember, this is not overriding the context. If there is a context from fictional positioning as who should be attacking whom, that's, if there's an overriding reason already, hey, the wizard just fireballed us, take out the wizard, then this doesn't apply. This only applies if you're literally, as a GM, saying, I don't know who I should be attacking, which in a sense to me comes up maybe once a combat. So I'm not expecting it should come up all that much. But of course, different games may be different, so I can't say, but I wasn't going to put any limiters on it because I just don't think it comes up that much. If it's something that comes up a lot in your game, then maybe you could do some kind of limiter, but I don't imagine it would be. But I mean, even then, I'm wondering, what would the harm be? So thieves get to be a little bit more sneaky, presumably, but only in this very limited capacity, which I'd be okay with. And remember, it's context. As soon as the thief shivs somebody, that person's probably attacking them, and then they don't get to take account of this. So if they're kind of trying to sneak around or something, then maybe they could creep around the battlefield, whatever, but it's not not like some kind of invisibility. Or for the fighters, they're just taking attacks on themselves. So they're just taking, so it's like, yeah, you're saving somebody else, but at my expense. So I'm not sure what the downside would be with it happening fairly often. Though again, I really hadn't thought that far. But my working assumption is that this, as a GM, this question you ask of, gee, I don't know who the brigand should shoot at, isn't one that is, super, or at least not one that comes up that much. Because eventually somebody shoots at somebody, and then you get into the back and forth, whatever, and then, it's on. And then you're just moving from there. But if you don't know, if it really could be, I don't know who they're going to attack, and whatever, it's all the same to me, then, then you could use this to do it. What did I just get? Oh. Okay. Does that make sense? Anyway, I just thought that was kind of neat. Now, I'm actually kind of out of time, but we'll see if I can cover this quickly. I saw this thing called Exploits. It was actually posted to Reddit. It got very mixed views on Reddit. I thought it was kind of neat. It's from a game called 3 Bones. Brian Smith says they try not to question their internal GM choices in the game. Well, you don't have to question them, Brian. You just, again, if you're rolling randomly, then those 2 ways that players can kind of interject in the randomness. It doesn't really affect your choice at all. I wouldn't say that particular technique or mechanic interferes with GM choice. If you're making a choice, then that mechanic doesn't apply. The mechanic only applies in situations where you're not sure what to do. Well, Brian, I don't know how you run games, but I will often come into, like, for instance, you're in a cave. The party's in a cave and a slime drops from the ceiling in the middle of the party members. Who does it attack first? Like, it's a slime. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't usually have somebody. And I feel like the rolling is kind of the fairest thing to do, as opposed to me picking somebody. You know, you break through the trees and the brigands open fire. Who are they firing at? Like, I don't know, arrows are going everywhere, right? That, like, I don't know. Like, that's kind of the situation where it comes up to me anyway, or something of that nature. If there is, again, like, this is not meant to. Well, I mean, Brian says, okay, the brightest are the biggest. Well, yeah, but those things to me don't always apply. And who's the biggest? I don't know. You got two fighters. Who's the biggest? You got two people with torches. Who's the brightest? Like, or who's the smartest? I'm not sure. Like, I just feel like there are going to be times where nobody's going to stand out from the other one. They're juicier, but they're not as bright. They're brighter, but they're not as juicy. You know, if you've always got it in mind, Brian, you are a better man than I. And kudos to you for being on top of it like that. But I find that very often, and I think also just in terms of fairness, really as a GM, I think randomly sometimes is the way to go, because you can start biasing yourself towards somebody. They're always the best target, so they're always eating these kind of first attacks or stuff, and that's not always fair. Because remember, what you think is juicy is not necessarily what the slime thinks is juicy, or whomever. And I think a good way to just make sure that to kind of keep any of your biases in check or whatever is just to roll. But that's me. That's me. I'm happy to let the dice decide more often than not. Okay, so I want to talk about this thing, exploits. I'm going to try to be, I don't know, somewhat brief. Some guys say since they mostly do solo, they pretty much always roll randomly for attacks. Yeah, I mean, definitely if you're playing solo and you have multiple PCs or something, or PC and henchmen, yeah, it's just the fairest way. Last session they had nothing says last session we had an uncontrolled golem that attacked randomly. Yeah, or like undead. Like, who's the undead attack? Maybe if you have a cleric, they might attack the cleric. I don't know if that even makes sense, but yeah, zombies, skeletons. There are lots of unintelligent and things. And again, also there might be other reasons where it's just like everybody's in basically the same standing, so no one is more advantageous or disadvantageous. So it just becomes a dealer's choice, so to speak. Okay, so here's this exploits. This is part of 3 Bones. I linked to it in the show notes. Called Exploits and Advancement. After each session, each PC gains 2 exploits, one decided by the player and one decided by the GM or another player. Exploits are short sentences about a significant, impressive, character-defining, or educational experience that a PC had. They don't need to be successes. Spectacular failures or events witnessed as a bystander can also be very influential on a character's development. In future sessions, a PC can, quote-unquote, draw on experience by tapping exploits. Mark an exploit with a check mark and gain. I think so. Some of this are mechanics from the game that I haven't even read, so I don't even know. But obviously, it's like beginning like some kind of bonus to attack, right? Something you could use in your advantage, or call it inspiration if you want to use kind of 5e relevance. Exploits can also be spent permanently, and you would mark them as such to alter a PC's traits. And this is kind of give you an advancement thing. Maybe you gain, you gain a hit die, or you gain a bonus to attack, or could be, anything. And then, so some of this other stuff gets more kind of into their particular mechanics, but then I like this part also. If a PC dies, the group can keep their character sheet to draw on memories of the dead. Any PC who knew the deceased can use one of the dead PC's exploits by describing how the dead PC taught them a trick or reminiscing with a mutual friend about how the dead PC earned that exploit. A dead PC's exploits can only be used once each in this way, so cross them off after using them. These quote-unquote gifts from the dead make good choices for exploits for the PC that uses them in that session. So, okay. I just thought this was really cool. I like this a lot. To me, I was reminded of kind of boasts from Wolves on the Coast. Remember when we looked at Wolves on the Coast? The boasts mechanic where you would make a claim you're going to do something, and then as long as you're attempting to do it, and then if you succeed to do it, you get that. So it's like you level up ahead of doing the thing that you're going to do to level it up. Like, I'm going to kill the giant. So then you level up, but then you got to kill the giant kind of thing. This is kind of neat because it's kind of works in a bit of the reverse. I mean, yes, and it's like experience points, but instead it's like there are a couple things I like about it. What I like about it, not just being, hey, you're earning XP, is because it's encouraging you to kind of keep a log of your exploits. I mean, this to me is like to me feels like a real Conan-y sword and sorcery kind of thing. Remember that time we we barely escaped the tower of the elephant. It's like, great, that's an exploit. And then later on, I can, and I would probably ask for something more detailed, something specific you did, but whatever. Remember that time we were able to communicate with the alien elephant thing in the tower, and that did something. Like, oh yeah, like that's cool. So I write that down. That becomes my exploit. Now in a later game, some future session down the line, maybe we meet some kind of other alien thing, and I can use that exploit to help me in that situation, which you could do anyway. Granted, you could talk to your GM and say, oh, GM, do you remember back sessions ago when we talked to the elephant alien thing? I'd like to leverage that to talk to this alien octopus thing, squid thing. Yes, you could. But I like the way this is kind of mechanized, and I like the way it encourages you to write down the stuff that your particular character did and pick out of the stuff that your character did in a particular session what you thought. And I would even, he says like, hey, you mark one down and then another player or the GM marks one and writes one for you. I would say that you write one and maybe another player does it. Take the GM out of I would just say, take the GM out of the whole thing entirely. You get to use them. You're writing down these things and you're getting someone from someone else. Hey man, you did this awesome thing. You did a triple gainer off the top of that bookshelf and landed on the whatever. It's like, that's awesome. Totally an exploit. And then the next time you can do that again. You can only do, you can use them this way once. And, you probably think, well, I could build up 1,000 of these. Sure, you could, but then you're never leveling up, because the other part is you spend them permanently to level them up. So you're getting them, but then you're wanting to trade them in to level up. Now, they have a very simple kind of system when they get into the leveling up bit, and I'd probably want to futz around with that to fit it more. But I just thought that was a really cool idea. And I love the idea that you have these of the dead player characters, that you could take these exploits of a dead PC. One, it means that even a PC that dies, maybe in session 2, because you do this at the end of a session, so they got to make it through one session first to get an exploit. I would even say I would actually maybe give you one for free. That you have at character generation, right? That PC that you can you could use those memories, and you can only use them once, which is cool. You can't reuse them, but then kind of like the player character lives on for a bit, and then. I just thought that was neat. I just thought it was cool. When it got posted on Reddit, a bunch of people kept kind of hammering at it because they're like, this is an OSR. Like these OSR, like, I don't know, gatekeeping ideas. Like, don't do that, first of all. Be a good OSR citizen. I feel like any game system, whether it's an OSR-ish kind of game or not, you can always learn things from looking at rules that are beyond your little corner. We do not need to trap ourselves anywhere and start saying, oh, this idea is terrible because it's not OSR. Why did you bring it in here? Like, relax, people, okay? Because there is good things in here. And by the way, there were systems like Arduino Grimoire that, granted, they used XP charts, but they were XP charts that would give you XP points for doing exploits, but they were essentially just written ahead of time. In this case, you're just doing them for yourself, as opposed to taking off the list that Arduino Grimoire had. Wolves on the Coast, this is it has a lot of similarities to the Boast system. This is not your enemy. I think it's a really neat idea. Nothing says is if their GM was going to use this, they would generate exploits for monsters and enemies too. I mean, you don't need them. Nothing. I wouldn't feel the need to. I mean, I'm not saying don't. I just don't know why I'd need to, because for what does an exploit do mechanically for a monster? It just gives them a bonus to attack for something like I'm in combat. I'm in combat with the owlbear, and the owlbear remembers back to when those trappers, when it escaped from that owlbear trap and mauled the trapper, and so he uses that to give a bonus to hit you. It's like, I don't feel like you need it for that. I mean, I wouldn't, though it would be nice to have that little somehow the PCs are privy to the owlbear's thought process for a moment, as it has that recollection and then attacks with increased vigor. It's like, I don't think you need it for those, but I guess if you wanted to do good for the goose, good for the gander, sure. But I feel like this, to me, is just something that PCs want. If you wanted to do it for a powerful NPC or somebody, I guess, but they're earned through play, and NPCs and monsters don't generally earn things through play, right? They're where they are supposed to be when you kind of want them to be there. The big bad evil guy is not earning things through actually trying. I mean, granted, there are some cases where they are, Maybe I would say if you're going to do it that way, then it can only be something that they exploit if they happen to engage with the PCs and have some danger to themselves. Then maybe they could do it. Otherwise, it's just like you're just giving yourself bonuses. And if you want to give the monster a bonus to do something, you can just give it to them. You don't need to do it. But hey, if you want, play it however you like to. But I wouldn't feel the need to do that. I just thought this was a cool system. I don't really have anything else to say. I might write something up about this because I think it's got some neat applications. And certainly I think if you have players who maybe you wish were more into tracking down what the heck they do every session, this might be a reason to, because at least they're going to write down a couple of things when they're going to keep track of their their progress of doing daring do in the world. This might get them to do it. I guess that's all I've got. I don't think I have any more. The hour's up. I'll let you guys get back to your days. Enjoy the rest of your day, night, whenever you end up watching or listening to this. Thanks for hanging around with me through this, what did I call this? A hodgepodge of hacks. I'll talk to you soon. Game on, everybody. Bye now.